In recent Western mainstream media coverage of the Syrian war, and within Western military analyst circles, there is much ongoing hype about the US-backed SDF, or Syrian Democratic Forces, offensive to take the self-proclaimed Syrian capital of the Islamic State, the city of Al-Raqqa. At face value, the probability of the Kurdish YPG-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces taking Al-Raqqa is, quite frankly, highly unlikely. To begin with, the geography of the battlefield favours ISIS as defenders far more than it favours the SDF as attackers. In order to first reach the city, the SDF will have to attack through marshes and then across the river Euphrates as they attempt to encircle the city, which will be absolutely necessary. As Kurdish forces move to capture the city itself, they'll have to contend with a fanatic ISIS defense within an urban environment where they'll be very vulnerable to booby traps, sniper fire, and car bomb attacks. Also, since the beginning of the battle for Mosul in Iraq, the Islamic State has moved large reserve forces towards Al-Raqqa from Iraq. In defending this principal road hub, which acts as the gateway to the northern half of the Euphrates, it is likely that ISIS will commit 2,500 troops in the initial phase of the battle, followed by a doubling or possibly even a tripling of this number as the battle develops and strategic reserves are relocated from less active fronts in Iraq and Syria. Even if the SDF really has 30,000 troops, as they claim, dedicated to their Raqqa offensive, which is most likely not the case, this technical superiority does not guarantee victory. In the battle for Mosul, we can see that some 50,000 Iraqi soldiers from the nation's professional army, all in highly mechanized formations, backed by heavy coalition air power, and with a generous supply of modern Western-designed weapon systems and equipment, have only seized 1/3 of the city, already at the expense of thousands of casualties in 2.5 months against a force of ISIS fighters numbering no more than 10,000. Finally, it must be acknowledged that the standard Islamic State soldier is far more willing to die in battle than his SDF or Syrian army counterpart. In order to have any chance of being able to capture Al-Raqqa from ISIS, the SDF would need to encircle the city before attempting to storm it. In completing this very first operational task, the SDF would need to launch powerful attacks from multiple axes via the western, northern, and eastern approaches to the city. For the sake of operational soundness, the western bank of Lake Assad would have to be secured. During this entire time, the SDF would be highly vulnerable to Islamic State counterattacks from both the east and the south. There are some analysts which contend that the SDF is only attacking in the general direction of Al-Raqqa city and that the city itself is not a target for conquest. Rather, they argue, the real objective of this predominantly YPG-led advance is to secure more economic prizes like the Tabqa Dam and the oil fields of central Syria, as well as the oil fields and agricultural zones along the line of the river Euphrates. The logic behind this argument is that the possession of such economic assets will, after all, provide the Syrian PYD with more bargaining power in any post-war negotiations for carving out its Kurdo-centric state. This is opposed to the costly seizure of a city which only rewards the United States with a PR victory on the international stage, rather than achieving any Kurdish-orientated goals in Syria. It is possible that in the first phase of the battle for Raqqa, ISIS may very well allow SDF forces to bypass the city to the south for the sake of conserving its strategic reserves for future counterattacks in the area, and despite the fact that this will endanger the Islamic State formations operating in the Al-Bab combat zone to the northwest. However, one thing that is for sure is that ISIS will definitely not allow the SDF to push down the length of the Euphrates, where highly valuable economic assets are at stake. The main belt of defences which defend the Islamic State's communication lines between Al-Raqqa and the rest of its Syria-based empire will likely be located along the line of the Euphrates and throughout the marshlands to the north of Al-Raqqa. Overall, there can be no doubt that the Islamic State will commit massive resources to the defense of its self-proclaimed capital in Syria for both strategic and political reasons, as has been demonstrated in the battle for Manbij, the battle for Mosul, and the battle for Al-Bab. The Islamic State will most likely concentrate its defensive power within the immediate vicinity of the city and within the urban terrain of the city itself. As mentioned earlier, the defensive lines on the periphery of the combat sector will be anchored along the Euphrates. At the same time, ISIS will most probably conduct general counterattacks from the east and the south to prevent a full encirclement of the city by the SDF and to bleed the SDF manpower resources away from the actual storming of the city. In this respect, car bombs, snipers, anti-tank guided missiles, booby traps, various types of non-vehicular suicide attacks, and field artillery will be the staple of the Islamic State's defensive firepower as it attempts to wrestle SDF forces into submission via an attritional slogging match. At this point, it is worth mentioning that, politically speaking, both the predominantly Kurdish elements of the SDF faction and the jihadists of the Islamic State abide by a fanatic ideology in Syria. On the one hand, the PYD-orientated YPG forces pursue a self-declared race ideal of carving out a Kurdish nation at the expense of the native Arabs, Assyrians and Turkmen of northern Syria, whilst on the other hand, the Islamic State forces aim to preserve their sectarian purist objective of a Salafist principality throughout the Levant. As with most armies which have historically been driven by such holistic and pitiless ideologies, the fighting will be brutal with very little regard for civilian lives on both sides. Whilst the Islamic State will willingly use civilians as human shields, as per typical, the Kurdish-led SDF forces will likely remain indifferent, and dare it be said even grateful, regarding the death and displacement of Arab civilians in and around the city as a result of intense firefights and typically indiscriminate bombing by coalition air power.